Here with more on the subject is our grumpy old man.
This is the Grumpy Old Man Podcast, hosted by Dave Mathwin. So close your yapper and just listen.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode. Thank you so much for joining us once again. Today, I am delighted to have, making his grumpy old man debut, Mr. Jace Gibson Jr. at Pontus Academy. Hello, Jace. Welcome. Hello. And back, and no doubt better than ever, for another appearance on the Grumpy Old Man. We're delighted to have back with us again, Miss Lily Oak, AFA Senior. Welcome back, Lily.
Hello. Thank you.
All right. So today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be discussing the concept of liberty in its role in American culture and politics, and shall we say, maybe do we need to distinguish political liberty from our concept of spiritual liberty? So this should be interesting, and I look forward to our discussion. So I asserted, so both, for context, ladies and gentlemen, both Lily and Jace are in the American history class this year, and I made the assertion that a lot of America's conflicts or disagreements or issues or what have you are rooted in a disagreement about the meaning of liberty. And the political philosopher Isaiah Berlin, earlier in the 20th century, distinguished two different kinds of liberty: positive liberty and negative liberty. Now, I'll briefly, Lily, Jace, I'll just kind of give the spiel I gave in class. I'll condense it a little bit for the benefit of our audience here. So, negative liberty is freedom from a thing, freedom from coercion, freedom from the state, freedom perhaps from tradition or whatever it might be. It is negative in that it is removed from a thing. So I think it's fairly clear, I think it's relatively clear that our founders had this conception of liberty, at least most of them did. The idea that we wanted freedom from, England, freedom from the king, etc., to forge our own path. And liberty means having, essentially, we might say, your own choice and not being compelled to choose based on something that stands outside of you or above you, or however you might want to say it. Positive liberty is, as Isaiah Berlin framed it, freedom towards a thing. So while the goal, while positive liberty isn't choiceless, the idea is that choosing is essentially a secondary good aimed towards, we might say, not wanting to choose or not needing to choose. Having options so that your options can narrow and put you, shall we say, in a funnel and kind of shoot you out a little bit. So I use the example in class, positive liberty of, we might say, dating and marriage. You should have, I think, well, anyway, most people would say you should have some kind of freedom to date maybe this person or that person, but eventually, right, you're working towards not choosing anymore, or shall we say, making a final sort of choice. And then after you get married, you've just said to yourself and to others, I'm done choosing, I've chosen already. And the guy, right, who just serially dates for his whole life, seems like a guy who's misfired in life. Be single or be married. Sure, for a time, date and see what's up. But after a while, right, pick a side, choose a lane so you can actually go somewhere. Would you guys agree, Jace, Lily, that this is a fair description of the two different kinds of liberty? or two different ways of conceiving of liberty.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good. So great. So we're back then to where we were in class. And as I mentioned in the introduction to the podcast video, if you haven't seen that, one of the main reasons for having this podcast, that I wanted to have this podcast, is so that we could continue conversations that seemingly, get cut short in some way. So here we go. Where do you guys stand on this question? And I suppose we can start with liberty defined in a political sense. We've got the negative liberty, the positive liberty side. Where do you stand? And briefly give us a defense of why. Jace, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'm definitely in the negative liberty camp. I just see it as more, well, not to be redundant, but it's more like liberating, right? Like there's more stuff that you're allowed to do. I think that there's definitely consequences to the things you do in negative liberty, but at the same time, like I don't think that there should be any restrictions. Like the positive liberty camp is all about like, let's take away like potentially harmful options so that you can't like hurt yourself or something like that. Whereas like negative liberty is more like you can do that, but it's just not a good idea. And I just see that as more like it gives you more choice.
And so for you, I think maybe we might say for the negative liberty camp, Jace, choosing is in of itself is liberty, right? It's the choice, not so much the goal, but the choice
Right.
itself.
Yeah, I might even go so far as to say like choosing is kind of liberty. Like especially if you think about like Adam and Eve in like the garden, like they had the choice to like eat the fruit, right? Like that the entire point that like the fruit was there was that they had like a choice to turn away from God. So
Yeah, so you're saying that it was important that there be a sort of test of will for them.
Yes, and
Okay.
I see that as a negative liberty test.
A negative liberty test. All right, good. I like that. Very excellent. Thank you, Jace. Lily, where do you stand? And a brief defense of why.
Yeah, so I generally, in a purely political sense, usually fall on the negative liberty side. I agree with a lot of what Jay said in the sense of I believe America was founded on the principle that we will have an intelligent population who will be able to make their own choices, that where the government oversteps their boundaries and makes choices for the people is not the sort of government that we were designed to have. I agree with Jace that personal choices are a very important part of a successful government versus citizen. I guess you could kind of say relationship there, that there's definitely a separation. I believe that if you're not able to make your own choices, that your actions then aren't exactly your own, and that in America, government was made to protect, not to overpower.
Okay. All right. So, so my perspective is, I lean a little bit in the positive liberty direction. Here's my thought, and I'd like your responses. So it seems like, right, when you study a lot of civilizations, Egypt was very definitely about a certain kind of thing. Greece, very definitely about a certain kind of thing. People knew what it meant to be an Athenian, an Egyptian, a Roman. I think probably up until fairly recently, people knew what it meant to be English, French, Japanese. Not that everybody's the same, but that there is a sort of common identity that people are molded towards. If you're French, right, you're supposed to grow up liking, coffee and French bread or whatever. America, I agree with you, was, I think, founded on somewhat different principles. My question is, if we build our society on you can choose your own, your own way of being, way of thinking, way of whatever, what then what draws us together then as Americans? What holds us together? What is, would you say then, is our common identity? Jace, go ahead if you have a thought.
I haven't really thought about that a whole lot, but like I definitely do think that like freedom of choice is in there, right? Like we're a nation that was founded through rebellion, right? Through rebellion of being able to like do our own thing, right? The pilgrims came here because they were being persecuted for their faith, and they wanted to have the ability to like choose their own path in their faith and do their own thing. And when the British were kind of imposing on us here, we rebelled against them and declared our independence, sticking the flag in the ground, saying, no, we want to govern ourselves. So I think that independence and freedom to like do what we want to do is very ingrained in American culture from the very beginning.
Lily, do you have a thought on this question? What holds us together?
Yeah, so it's very obviously with the negative liberty side, when you think I make my own choices for myself, you obviously see a lot of different directions, as we are not, as people, we're all, very different and value different things. But I agree with what Jay said in the sense of when America was founded, we were making our own choices together. Now, that's not to say that now our own choices always coincide, because they most certainly don't. But I feel like if we have the agreement that is, I think for myself and I make my own choices as an intelligent human being with the ability to make choices, it's there, that in itself is a common ground. That I feel like if choices are in a way forced on you, then while maybe outwardly you have more in common in that you're all doing the same thing, there's actually less common ground in the thought process and actual fundamental ideals of what it would mean to be governed that way. So I think, yeah, just that knowing freedom and intelligent decision making in itself is a form of unity. It seems like it's a complete juxtaposition, but I don't know if I'm explaining it very well. But if you realize that you all have that at the same time, whether or not you agree on an issue, there is at least common ground that as a citizen you're all equal in that.
Jace, what would you think there about Lily's explanation? What holds us together is that I respect you and as a self-governing individual, you respect Lily as a self-governing individual, and like we're all. How does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I can agree with that. Especially like I was saying, we're all about like governing ourselves or whatever, right? So kind of respecting each other's ability to govern themselves, I see as a very American ideal. So I think I can get down with that.
Okay, all right. So I guess, right, America has attempted this experiment. And by the way, if I'm going to push back on you guys with negative liberty, you guys should also push back with me on positive liberty. Feel free to turn the tables at any moment here. So I wonder, right, if you take a look at the scope of our history, you need some kind of commonly stated goals, or commonly stated basically a basic framework within which to act that you can accept differences on. So, for example, we accept the fact, not that America is unique in this, but that you have to wear clothes. We'd say, look, there's lots of different clothes you can wear. You can wear, a sweatshirt. You can wear, a collared shirt, whatever. But you're wearing something, right? We have certain parameters, and that way, when we dress, I can say, oh, okay, you like sweatshirts. Oh, okay, you like t-shirts. Fine. But we all know that we're wearing clothes. I guess if America is just, we're all just choosing. You can choose here, you can choose there, you can choose this, you can choose that. I'm wondering about the common platform. Is there anything, can you be held together by an absence of a defined goal? What holds us together is a negative sign, right? How would you respond to that? Either one of you can jump in.
Well, I'd say that, negative liberty, obviously there are extremes to both sides of this, like you said.
Sure.
Like, there's definitely the negative liberty that can go all the way into like pure anarchy, and that is not something I'm defending here. I'd say that common framework is our Constitution. Like, we're founded on certain principles, and we do have certain rules in place. And I personally, believe that a government is a necessary part of any, country that works. It's a matter of like how much give the government has, how much influence they have on personal citizens' lives. I would argue that framework, those rules we have in place, are the bones of the Constitution that are then, to give an example, like, we have certain offenses will send people to jail, right? Those are things like people know, okay, I'm not going to go kill somebody because that is a very bad thing, and our country says no, and I will get in prison for that. Like, those are good rules to have. But when it comes to things like, I know we talked in class about, and this is an extreme, but about, healthy eating. The government should not be mandating, how you eat, because it could have some negative effect on you. So they're the fundamental framework that came from the Constitution in our original founding, that I think the vast majority of Americans can agree on as a basis, from which we can sort of like branch out and have our own ideals and beliefs and run our own lives. But that so long as that foundation is there, we still have common ground and rules to regulate our lives so that it's not complete anarchy.
Jace, what are your thoughts on that?
Wait, so to clarify, are you asking, like, can a society work with kind of like an absence of like common ideals?
Right, yes, yes. So you guys both suggested, right, that what holds us together is respecting choices. Right. So, but those choices could hypothetically be fairly divergent. Right. And almost, we might say, contradictory, eventually contradictory. So what is it then that that is the glue that prevents us, from going so far or turning against, having those choices kind of bend back around against each other?
I mean, I guess in a sense there isn't much of a glue, because like if you found a nation on like certain principles, right, that nation in its lifespan is going to take those principles as far as humanly possible, right? There's going to be an extreme that's going to be hit at some point, and like if you see with like the Roman Empire or something, it normally ends in like its collapse or whatever. But I think the thing that's keeping like American ideals and such, and like ideals of like other nations from diverging too much, is just kind of like maybe like the will of the people, and like a cultural agreement to like, let's not do anarchy or something along those lines. Because like I'll agree, like if you take negative liberty too far, you'll reach anarchy. If you take positive liberty too far, you'll probably end up in like a dictatorship, right? Mm-hmm. So there's certain boundaries that you want to set for yourself with your core beliefs in the nation. Like, we're not going to go past this line, because that's where it starts getting like dark and shady and such.
What do you think? So Lily suggests it's the kind of framework of the Constitution that holds us together. Do you have another suggestion? You seem to be suggesting it's more along, not so much maybe certain procedures, but certain beliefs. Is that?
Maybe kind of, sort of. I do I do definitely agree with what Lily was saying about the Constitution, because like if you think about it, the Constitution is like literally a set of rules that's like president can't do this, this, and this, because like if he can do that, it's not going to end well for anyone, right? Like it's a set of boundaries, like a sort of barrier that we're agreeing that we're not going to go past, right? We're gifting ourselves a lot of freedom, but there's certain things that we're just not going to impede on, like like gun rights, freedom of speech, all the other stuff that's in the Constitution, right? So I guess yes, there is like a sort of cultural belief agreement to that, but I think that the Constitution is like a sort of embodiment of that in a way.
Okay, so you see it as Constitution not so much as setting principle or procedures. Here's how you pass a law, but it's meaning to give some kind of framework for certain kinds of values that we share.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So I will agree that it's not as if America has never got off the ground or failed. It's also not true that we haven't had our problems, because obviously we have, but so does every nation at some point in time. So do you see these values? Okay, so you've talked about values. We've talked about procedures. Maybe you could say these values, the procedures are there in the Constitution, the values are there perhaps in the Bill of Rights. Why do you think we are struggling so much now to figure this out? What is it about our current moment? And it's not just our current moment. This is the first time, of course, that this has happened to us. We did fight a civil war before. There has been, other times of great, political controversy or political shifts. We talked about the election of 1800, Andrew Jackson, and there are others. What is it you think that is? Are we now arguing about the meaning of liberty or the boundaries of liberty? What are we struggling with currently? I mean, aside from the particular issues, well, we disagree. People don't like Trump, or people are devoted to him, or people don't like wokeness or whatever. But beyond that, what is driving this difference, our cultural divide, would you say?
I think it's in two parts. It's an argument between positive and negative liberty at its core, and also like an argument on what the Constitution really means, right? On the Constitution, like as you said, we were talking about Andrew Jackson when he made like the Louisiana Purchase, right?
Jefferson, actually.
Oh, that was sorry. I'm really bad with names. Whoever made the Louisiana Purchase.
Right.
There's a big debate about like whether or not he can do that, because it doesn't explicitly say in the Constitution that he's allowed to, but it doesn't say that he's disallowed to. So there's a lot of battles going on nowadays that's like, what are we actually allowed to do, like within the boundaries of the Constitution? And then on the flip side of that, there's also like the arguing between positive and negative liberty, where some people are like take smoking, for example, right? A lot of people want to illegalize smoking because it's harmful for you and there's literally nothing good that comes out of it, right? It's basically just like killing yourself over the course of like 10 years or so. And then there's another group of people that are like, oh yeah, no, we shouldn't legalize that. It's a stupid idea. You probably shouldn't smoke, but at the same time, we shouldn't legalize doing that, right? Like there's nothing in the Constitution that says that we can't do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the main issue we have now is there's a lot of like infighting between those two ideologies, and it's just kind of hard to find a compromise.
Lily, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, because you can, make the argument of like, we want smoking to still be legal without actually being a proponent of it, because at that point, are you supporting, do you believe people can make their own decisions? And that is an issue that America struggles with. I think it also stems to political dependency from from a citizen perspective, how much, and this definitely, I mean, they coincide with each other. The negative positive liberty issue, like this, that's kind of its core root here. But that if a people believes that they need the government to parent them, that, you know, the other side obviously would say, no, we don't want a government to bother us at all. So there's a sort of like dependency issue of how much involvement do we want from the government? How much do we, I mean, because there's the crowd that says the government gives you stuff. This is great. Like, we want help from the government. We can have more benefits. This will improve our daily lives. But then there's the other side that would say, you know, if the government gives you free stuff, then there's drawbacks and strings attached, and then you're under the government's thumb. And that also, I think, can stem from negative positive liberty, because in the sense of the government saying, we can put forth all of these great things so that you can sort of, unless I'm misconceiving that, but like, that you won't have to make the choice on your own. You kind of, this is a good thing, we're leading you in the right direction, trust where it's going, versus we're completely controlling the actions you want to take. So it can be from that government perspective, but then also the citizen side of just not completely knowing how much to depend on a government for aid versus from your own decision making. I think those definitely go hand in hand, and if not, you know, are the same issue, then are very similar, and definitely cause a lot of the turmoil we're seeing in politics these days.
Right, yes. So maybe we can think of it in these terms. Yeah, if negative liberty goes too far, you have a kind of anarchy, maybe a Wild West. You know, I mentioned in class that I thought, you know, our problem with slavery was rooted in a kind of abuse of negative liberty. Hey, you know, no one can tell me how to live my life. If you don't want slaves, don't have them. But me, you know, I think that's the way to go. And we found, I think, as a nation, and I think, you know, rightly so, that we couldn't, that divergence of a belief just couldn't hold. It couldn't hold. And we had to do something about it. It was tragic that we couldn't work it out other than violence, but I do think we probably did have to work it out. So on the other side, right, positive liberty, sure, you could see like the communists, like the Soviet state, as an obvious example of an abuse of positive liberty, where you have to be this thing where you're channeled in by the party, and, you know, eventually, like under Stalin, at the worst of it, right, under Stalin, you know, you didn't want to even be like the first one to stop clapping after a Stalin speech. I mean, so there are obvious extremes. Maybe we can link it to, right, how we observe, how we act in creation, how we act even in our own selves. We can think of maybe negative liberty as a kind of breathing out, you know, kind of dispersing ourselves. We can think of positive liberty as breathing in, concentrating ourselves, gathering ourselves up. And you don't want to exhale, like if all you're doing is like, you know, breathing, like hyperventilating, that's not healthy for you. So I do agree that there needs to be a kind of give and take between these two things. I wonder if in our culture, one of our problems today is that you do see this kind of, on the one hand, right, in the 2016 election, you had people, or not the 2016 election, but in some of the Democratic primaries, you had some people saying open borders as a kind of counterweight to President Trump's build a wall, right? And if you ask most people, it's like, well, I don't know if I like either one. Today, do you see, some people would say too that the quote woke movement or whatever is a kind of positive liberty extreme. You have to only say these things, and we can't We all have to kind of be together. We can't hurt anybody by our words, by our this or that. Could there be a negative liberty counter, swing to the other side? Do we see that in the rise of militia movements or ethno-nationalism? Anyway, what do you see? Do you think that's a good analogy for today? And if so, what's the fix? How do we find common ground enough, but maintain enough space, for individuality?
You just mean like where do the two coincide the best? Like how does that look?
How do we find, if you accept the analogy, or you could challenge it if you'd like, where do we find a healthy, shall we say, rhythm of breathing? Where do we find a helpful give and take?
That's where, if I'm understanding you correctly, what I said earlier, the Constitution being some sort of framework like that in itself, you can think of as it's positive liberty. It's regulations, it's rules in place so that we don't have to, continuously cross those bridges. It can, like, these are set in place. So there is an amount of positive liberty there, but after that, each person is free to have their own negative liberty ideals. I think it definitely coincides there. In class, you mentioned the idea of, like traffic. If you don't set the rule of everybody drive on the right side of the road and this is what traffic lights do and listen to, the signs on the road, like then you have complete chaos and more car accidents and nobody can go from point A to point B safely. So those are obviously rules that we need to have in place. So there is a compromise, but in the sense of where it's protecting rather than prohibiting. So, but then you can take protecting to a far extreme. But you said that slavery, for example, was an extension, like a far exaggeration of negative liberty. In a way, I agree, but there's also the argument to be made when I say negative liberty, I'm thinking in terms of where my liberty does not infringe on somebody else's constitutional pursuit of happiness, like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. When you're abusing other people, that is no longer within the bounds of what negative liberty should mean, at least to me. Your liberty should be affecting you and your own choices. When you start, the abuse of slaves is like extremely wrong. And I know at that point there were different ideals as far as like what it meant to be a citizen and who was considered a citizen. But that wrestled with more issues, I would argue, than just an abuse of negative liberty, because then you could argue negative liberty is, just choosing to just hurt people all the time because you want to, which I would, strongly disagree with that.
Sure.
Because, that's where the sort of the two meet, because we need a positive liberty of, here are some very, basic fundamental rules, like, no, you cannot, beat people into submission. That's not how America works. That's, even without even, religion or morality, like that's just not, we can't form a country that way. So like, don't do that. Then people are like, okay, yeah, sure, we won't do that. And now we can make our own choices for our own lives.
Okay, so it seems though, Lily, if I might push back a little, it seems like, so you seem to go two things. You said, no, negative liberty has its own boundaries built within it. But then you said, we need a little positive liberty to balance it out. So I guess I'm just curious, are you saying that, so I like what you said, you revisited your idea earlier of the Constitution is already kind of that positive liberty framework. Yeah, sure, you can disagree with slavery, by slavery as abuse of negative liberty. Sure, that's fine. But I guess, see, the way I see it is positive liberty, the framework of positive liberty is a kind of one-way street. The framework of negative liberty is a kind of one-way street. And I'm not sure if either one has within it necessarily the proper, shall we say, barriers or buffers. I think that's why you kind of need both. You kind of need both lungs. You need both sides. But Jace, let's get back to you. Before we kind of continue with that, what do you think of how my framework of that, of this, the tension between negative and positive, and what would you say then is the solution or the issues we face now and a possible solution way forward?
Right. Well, as I said, we're facing a lot of problems about people kind of like debating between positive and negative liberty, and I think the ultimate solution to that would definitely to find compromises, right? I think the Constitution, like Lily said, was kind of a compromise between positive and negative liberty because it kind of uses positive liberty to enforce negative liberty in kind of like a weird, finicky way, if that makes sense. But yeah, we need to come up with like boundaries, I guess, and like kind of extents to which you can take certain things, right? Like with the smoking example I had earlier, right? A compromise there is like age restrictions, how like cigarette companies advertise it, right? Stuff like that. We're not just gonna let people buy cigarettes when they're 14, even if like sure they're allowed to do whatever they want. It's not hurting anyone else, it's just hurting them. But at the same time, like we don't want to have minors be able to like smoke and hurt themselves like that, right? So there's a compromise and a middle ground that we can make there, and I think that's like if we're going to survive as a nation, we definitely need to make a bunch of compromises like that.
Do you think those compromises should be legal or cultural? Do you think we should kind of ebb and flow with the time? Okay, like maybe we were a little bit more negative liberty in the past, so let's be a little bit more positive liberty now, and then we can go, I guess, how do we, is that compromise in liberty, is it found, I guess, in the law, or is it found in culture?
Right.
Do you have a thought there?
Well, yeah, I think to be honest, it has to be a compromise between law and culture, right? Because the way I see it, the American culture is very negative liberty oriented, especially because like we're a nation that's founded on rebelling so that we can do what we want.
Right.
That's pretty negative. Like if there's anything that's negative liberty, it's probably how we were founded.
Mm-hmm.
And the law itself is like setting, like it's there to set restrictions on how far we can take that negative liberty, right? So like I can't just go out in my backyard and like stab someone, right? Like that's not a thing I'm allowed to do, right? So the law in and of itself, I think, is kind of a compromise, right? So I think to answer your question, I think we need to compromise between our culture and our laws to kind of mix the American ideology with like how we do things, right? Like mix our beliefs with our procedure a little bit.
Can you give me, it's an interesting idea, Jace. Do you have a specific example in mind? Or maybe you want to think about it?
I can use the smoking example again,
Okay.
right? Like say I'm a 14-year-old kid, which I'm not, I'm a bit older than that, but like, and I go to a gas station and I try and like buy cigarettes, right? Like sure, it's my body. Like I'm not hurting anyone else by like smoking cigarettes. Like why should I not be able to do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's because the law sets a restriction there that's not going to let me do that because it's harmful to me, and like we have kind of like compromised an agreement there that like I shouldn't be allowed to do that at that age, right? Maybe I guess in this case it's because I'm like legally not allowed to make that decision or something, or like not capable of. But yeah, there's a compromise there between the I'm allowed to do whatever I want with my own person and the like you probably shouldn't do this with your own person thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Lily, back to you. Do you have do you see it as a legal situation, a cultural situation? If it's legal, we could hypothetically do it quickly, especially if one party controls Congress and the White House. Cultural, but that could easily flip. Maybe that's an advantage. Maybe we should go kind of back and forth depending on what is the dominant value system of the time. Cultural is, I think, longer lasting, but takes also a lot longer to build. It's more stable in a way, but it requires a lot of cooperation over time. Maybe we don't have that in us, at least not at the moment. What do you think?
I'm not certain what you mean by cultural as far as liberty is concerned, because
Okay,
as far as like the values people hold.
Yes, kind of right. Kind of the values people hold or the practices. I guess like to Jace's smoking example, you could say, yep, if you're 14, nope, we're going to make a law about it. Or we could say over time, like, look, this is just something we don't do, you know? Like, we just, as Americans, 14-year-olds don't smoke. But, right, because if you make it a law that 14-year-olds can't smoke, and that's what we rely on. On the flip side, you could say we could make it a law that now 14-year-olds can smoke. Enjoy it, you know, go 14-year-olds, go. Why? Because we switched the law. So again, there is, you know, there are problems on both sides. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, it's obviously harder, like you said, to instill a certain value in an entire country, and like, you know, we'll never have complete common ground there. I think a lot of it stems initially like from laws, and from just, you know, straight up like, this is how America's going to work from government to citizen. This is how we make laws. This is how we set regulations. I think the smoking example is a good one in part. I think also, I mean, Jace did say this, like, I mean, for a 14-year-old, like, when you're a minor, that also just brings in the issue of like, you're not like a legal, you know, adult, like in the eyes of the law, capable of making those decisions, because like you're not full grown. So that also is its own issue. It's not like we're saying, it would be different if the government was saying like, well, people ages, you know, 20 through 27 are like they're full grown adults, like are just stupid and are not capable of making their own choices. So we're gonna say that smoking is illegal for them. Like, that seems like a way more controlling move, right? Because it's not a like, you know, they could be, well, you know, out of college, it depends on the person, but like you could be, you know, very well educated, very wise person, but because you're 26 years old, you're not allowed to smoke. Like, that would be a huge, in my opinion, like overstep of the government to target one specific group when it doesn't have the issue of like being a minor. So I think it stems from a legal basis, definitely. Ideally, we'd get to some form of at least, you know, a cultural agreement, and we kind of, the vast majority of Americans do have that sort of underlying, like, I don't think there are too many Americans who would be like, you know, geez, guys, we should have just like not fought the revolution, like stayed in England, and, you know, wow, why did we do that? Like, regardless of your political stance now, they're generally agreed upon ideals that Americans hold in general now. They're not extremely widespread in the sense of like how many there are, but we do have some basic fundamental American principles now. But I think if it were to carry out either more negative or more positive, yeah, I think it would have to start legally and sort of gradually progress into a cultural change.
So we've picked an easy example, in a sense, minor smoking, but there are tougher examples. Like, for example, the current, you know, debates about speech, about what can be said, all right? And these are all kind of cultural questions. Yeah. You could say something that could be perceived as offensive, and you're not going to jail for it, but you could lose your job for it. You could be ostracized, or, you know, whatever. So it seems like, in many ways, right, the only fix, like, it seems to me like the only fix for this, in a sense, is a cultural fix. Either we say, we're not going to say, you know, X, Y, Z kinds of words or things as a culture, or we are like, or we are like, how are we going? Because we can't. That's not a legal fix. It's one of our tough, thorny cultural questions.
Yeah.
You guys will be in college soon, within the next year or so, and yeah. So how would you say you're on a how we can't really legally fix it?
Yeah.
What is the cultural fix then? Would you say on that question, which is tougher, I think?
Well, it's like you said, it definitely can't be a legal fix, right? Because like the Constitution is in place and it's there to say like the government's not going to be able to step in on anything you say, right? So it's definitely an exclusively cultural issue in terms of how to fix that. I mean, there's always going to be stuff that you just like can't say culturally, right? Like that they have stuff like that in every culture. There's
They're
things that
taboo,
are
right?
yeah. There's taboos, there's things that are just like rude, things that are inappropriate that you just can't do, right? And I mean, there's not really a way to just get rid of that, right? Like it's kind of like a hydra's head, you know, like you kill one like bad cultural thing and then like two more spring out of it, right? There's always going to be things in our culture that are considered taboo, and I don't see a huge issue with that, at least for the most part. Um, but if there is something that needs fixing, I think we would honestly just have to like talk about it and then like try and come to like an overall agreement, like as a society, like is this acceptable? Is this like okay? Do we really care that much? Right? So something like that. Other than that, like it's normally not a huge issue with having like weird taboos or anything. That's just kind of a culture thing.
Jace, you bring up a good point. Every culture does have taboos with certain actions and taboos with certain speech.
Yeah.
I think one thing that maybe has happened is that we haven't really, like certain things have moved very quickly. And with our communications technology now, we can, one thing that is said in one place can go anywhere and everywhere and everybody can see it and everybody can react to it all at once. We don't right now have a good mechanism to process it like through our culture. It just seems to be kind of, it's almost like, or social processing on speed or something like that.
Yeah.
Which I think is one of the problems that we have, that certain things seem to be moving so fast, we haven't processed and really haven't come to a kind of agreement culturally about where we stand, that what can be said or couldn't be said, or whether we've gone too far on certain things or not. Lily, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's definitely a harder issue to solve when it's purely, cultural. I definitely think that America started to shift in the direction of like where the government needs to intercede on hurt personal feelings versus a change in like legal action. That I feel like without getting into the actual issue too much, that it definitely needs to be cultural change. I feel like I haven't thought too much about like what would an actual solution to this be, but I think it's a lot of, if people value their own liberty and their own freedom of speech, yes, great. If you also understand that other people have their own freedom of like they have their liberty and freedom of speech. Like if we as Americans can shift to a like, I have my liberty and so do they, that everybody can kind of, I know the question is how to get there. I think if we keep going in the direction we are, we may reach an extreme that we think, okay, now we've pushed it too far. I mean, if the government gets involved, if people can be punished for saying anything, then where is the freedom of speech gone? Like, obviously, like you and Jace both said, there are definitely things that are kind of taboo topics, for better, for worse. That's the way people are. That's how people interact and how cultures are formed, that happens. And as just a polite person, like, okay, don't go out of your way to break somebody's heart or like make their day worse, or like don't do that. But as from a moral perspective, but when it's purely political, I think when we reach a point that the government is needing to say like that was mean, like just because like if you hurt somebody's feelings, like that was mean. If we're on like small scale stuff, like we've gone too far and we might end up with a resurgence the other direction. I feel like there's a lot of, we try something, we go too far, we push back. Like that might end up being what happens. Like you push it too far and you learn a lesson, or it could go the other way too. And then we like drop any restriction and everybody's yelling at each other and you're like, well, this is disaster. Like now we need more regulations. So otherwise, I mean, you can't just have one person, preaching to a culture and be like, change your ways and be this way, because that's not that. You can't just change on the drop of a hat. That's not how any country is. There's no possibility of that ever going over well.
Yeah.
Jace, go ahead, and you got something to add?
I do. I think the real issue with like American culture, like what we're talking about now, is culture doesn't change like law does, right? It's a lot weirder, it's a lot more inconsistent, and it takes a lot longer, right? Like for law, if you want to change something, you get in a room, you sit down, and you're like, we're going to change this law, right? Like there's a little bit more to it than that, I'm sure, but I'm not a lawyer, so but like you can change laws a lot quicker than you can change culture, and a lot more consistently, right? Culture doesn't change by a bunch of people sitting in a room and like discussing something. Culture changes by something happening around you, right? So what if people decided that like leaving like not leaving tips after like having like a good service meal like is now acceptable, right? Like there'd have to be something that would happen that would like make people start thinking that way, right? You can't just like discuss like, oh yeah, this is what I think our culture should be, because like it kind of shifts dynamically, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no straight path of like what the American culture is going to look like, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, right?
Yeah.
Like after like 9/11 or something, right? Everyone like shifted pretty quickly to like, we need to go to war, right? That was kind of like a weird cultural shift that like 2 years prior no one would have expected, right? Everyone was pretty okay with being at peace until that happened. So again, like culture, it's harder to change.
Yes, it's harder to change and harder to, and harder to control. But it's interesting you mentioned like the idea of like law and culture and how things like take time. And that's what, if I had to say, if I could tell our culture one thing, it might be like slow down. Slow down. I remember, so I lived in the Deep South for a few years long ago, in Mississippi, actually, and experienced local culture there. And one of the local culture things there was a crawfish festival. So I thought, yeah, sure, I'll go eat crawfish. And I expected eating crawfish would be like eating shrimp, but it's not necessarily where I was, because the cultural practice was you take the crawfish, and the first thing you do is bite into the head and suck out the eyes and brains. And yes, like, and I was like, well, really, that's what we're doing? Like, funny, like if it was a law saying, you must eat crawfish this way when you're in Mississippi, I would have been like, well, I'm not down with that. Like, I'm going to be a lawbreaker. I'm rebelling against the system. But if it was like, okay, this is the cultural practice, and you just got here, so that's okay. If you wait a few years, and maybe you'll be doing, as we do. And maybe that would have been true, actually, but I thought, no way. If this is how I have to eat crawfish in Mississippi, I'm moving back up north. There was other reasons, of course, but I just think of that moment, like law would not have solved that problem. I wouldn't have eaten the crawfish that way. I just couldn't. But, time, maybe I would have changed. Yeah. So for our final topic, we've talked almost exclusively about political liberty, cultural liberty. We've talked about liberty in a political and a cultural, in political cultural terms, political and cultural terms. There, I said it finally. What about in spiritual terms? Because for Christians, it talks about being a slave to Christ, right? True freedom is being, we could say, like God. And God does, God cannot sin. Yeah, that's like God metaphysically, ontologically, whatever you want to say, but you wouldn't say that God is somehow less free. So I think there's been general agreement through a history of, Christian theology and doctrine and so on, that in the spiritual sense, positive liberty is our orientation. If that is so, it seems like we have a dilemma. If we have negative liberty in the culture, but positive liberty in our spiritual life, at least for Christians, at least as it's oriented towards God, obviously, will there be an inevitable disconnect? But on the other hand, right, if we say positive liberty for our spiritual life, so positive liberty for our cultural and political life, what are we leaving out? I think there are problems on both sides, or potential problems on both sides. So you guys are the negative liberty guys, though. How do you square that, shall we say, disconnect between, in your view, I guess, if you're a negative liberty person, mostly, between your spiritual life and your political and cultural life? Will there be an inevitable disconnect then?
Okay. Yes, I think a huge component to why those things are different is because the government is not God. So God is he is the divine. He is, creator of the world and all of, all things seen and unseen. All of the rules that he's given us in scripture, and there, are plenty of scripture verses, especially in the Old Testament, like with the law, like why are there so many laws? Why should we follow all these laws? And God, explicitly says, because I love you and I want for you to enjoy me. I want you to have an eternal life in heaven. Like it's for your good, which is pretty much, the definition of positive liberty. The difference there, at least for me, is that's God, your creator and the divine being and savior of everything ever. It's coming from him. It's not, the government is not a divine, infallible thing. It's people. And I don't think putting my personal decisions in another person's hand, I will always think is a bad idea. Like, I don't think, and while, yes, like we've said, I mean, our founding fathers, like, they were fallible people. They were human beings who came up with a constitution and a set of ideals that, like, and values that, like, this is what Americans do. But we weren't, I guess, required. It's a common ground, but it's not in, like, a salvation, like in Christianity, where God is the be all end all and you can place your trust in him. Your personal decisions are obviously affected, if not, controlled sounds like the wrong word, but I mean, controlled, filtered through, I guess, what scripture mandates. So, but yeah, that's coming from a perfect God, not from a government that is supposedly of the people, by the people, for the people. I think we were also founded on the separation of church and state, which is a slightly different issue in the sense of, like, our government isn't a Christian government, But I think if we get to a point where Americans regard the government like Christians think of God, then we're in a bad place because the government is fallible and the government is a body of people. I think that's probably one of the biggest contentions there, for me at least.
Okay. Jace, how about you?
Yeah, okay. In terms of like spirituality and like how that correlates with like earthly government or whatever, right? I'll say the natural like order of things is definitely like monarchy, right? Like if God was on earth right now, right? Like manifested in like a physical form, right? Like we should make him king and just roll with that for the rest of our lives, right? The problem is humans were kind of left on the earth to govern like ourselves, and we are prone to sin. It's like we have a literal sinful nature and we are constantly drawn to sin, right? Government exists to kind of make room for human error and human sin nature, right? Like there's going to be bad people in the government, and like things like the Constitution exist so that like they won't have as much power as say like an empire, right? But like in the Bible, God is described as a king, the King of Kings specifically, right? So like if we had a perfect politician, like that, like as perfect as like Jesus or as perfect as God, right? Like, yeah, no, we should have like we should make him king, but we don't, and we're never going to because humans have a sin nature. So I think in terms of like positive and negative liberty, like they kind of exist within our government more so than our spirituality, just because of like how human nature works, right? Like we're never going to have someone that's going to like tell us perfectly like what we should and shouldn't do, because like humans are like inherently flawed, if that makes sense.
Sure, it makes sense, and the answer is a good answer. I think that makes a lot of sense what you both said, and yet of course, government is fallible, sure, but so our parents are fallible when we listen to them. Bosses are fallible when we listen to them. We entrust in very important decisions, for example, to judges sometimes, and they're fallible people too. So I don't think we can't escape the fallible nature of people. And of course, I would never say that the government should make every decision. I would say this, though, as someone who thinks more in a positive liberty direction, the fact that we're, as a country, more negative liberty oriented is not necessarily a problem. It's, it is possible to be faithful and be at odds in some ways with your culture. Although I think it's important to recognize the tension, right? Your society's pushing you to say, be independent, be you, do what you do, drink Dr. Pepper. That just came out of the blue. You guys don't remember that ad campaign with Garth Brooks, right? Is it singing on this? It was a pretty good song, very catchy. It's probably why I remember it like 15 years later. Anyway, yeah, it was like, be you, do what you do, drink Dr. Pepper. Anyway, I think we should recognize that that message can be helpful in certain ways, but it's not necessarily helpful to the spiritual life as we approach, like the way we approach government or our fellow man necessarily can't be the way we approach God. I think but of course, early Christians within the Roman Empire, Jews in exile in Babylon or whatever, it's been like, yes, that has happened in places that were much less amenable to Christian belief than our current situation. So, yeah, I do think that, of course, it's possible. I do wonder, my concern is that if there's not enough cultural glue to hold us together, we'll need force to hold us together. We'll go back to law to hold us together. And that, I think, would be a mistake. And there, I think we might, all three of us, agree, if we rely too much on law to solve our problems, we're going to be, right. We're not going to suck the crawfish brains and eyes out first, I'm guessing, right? We'll probably we'll probably have to stand aside from the group on that one. Okay. Well, Jace and Lily, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you guys have any final thoughts on our subject?
Really, no.
No?
I think we hit every note.
I think we got mine just about every nook we could. Well, thank you so much again, guys, for joining us today and for our conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed it and that you'll be back for another episode. For now, we say goodbye. Jace, thank you so much for joining us.
Anytime.
All right. Lily, thank you again for your presence here with us.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been fun. Take care, and we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Grumpy Old Man podcast. Be sure to come back for more episodes and to check out his companion blog, astickthemud.com.